connection, and then the connection is dropped. Okay, so that's a very neat way of doing things, and I have a little demo. Again, that's demo number 3. So what I'm going to do now is, I'm on the Chinese server on my shiny little box in Shanghai, and I'm doing a telnet on my private server feuerteufel.wolfgarten.com, and I'm going to do speak HTTP to the server, and I'm going to request a website or a file basically. First, I'm going to request a file once I'm connected called test.html. So we're going to see as I type in get/test.html, and then the normal protocol stuff, HTTP 1.0 for instance, and I hit enter twice, and there's the answer. Great, HTTP works fine. So now basically we do the same thing, but I do request a file which does not exist on the remote server, but which I expect is filtered. Okay, so we do the same thing again. I connect to the server via telnet, port 80, and I request get, and then I'm going to request a file called Falun Dafa, which is, or Falun Gong I think? Falun Gong, yeah. And Falun Gong is a forbidden spiritual movement. And the moment I click, the moment I click enter twice, you see the connection is closed. Okay? And this is in real time, okay? So as I press enter twice, the connection was reset. Okay? So I wonder how they do it, because I mean for 130, 150 million users, that's a lot of stuff to do. You can do it with pattern matching and so on, but still I think it's a lot of stuff to do, and I was very surprised when I saw this. Yeah, I was very surprised, and obviously there are countermeasures that you can use, and I'm going to show you one which works very nicely against this way of cutting connections. But apparently it works quite well. Okay, so even if they employ DNS filtering, and if the DNS filtering does not work, then they have still other means to block you from accessing certain traffic or certain websites. Okay, certain information. Okay, now obviously what we need to do is we need to figure out a way to circumvent the filtering. Yesterday there was a big talk. From the guy that apparently wrote this Tor software, that about 35,000 people are using Tor in China already. So I decided to skip the section on Tor in this presentation, because yesterday the guy told us already a lot about it, and basically it works fine. So what you can do is you can use Tor in China. Okay, Tor works fine, but for 35,000 out of 130 million users, that's not a whole lot. So I decided to take a look at maybe easier, in some way, methods to defeat the Great Wall of China. Okay, so what can you do? Basically, you have to figure out how the filtering works. That's the most important bit. So basically, you have to attempt to enumerate the magnitude and the strictness of the filtering. So what this means is basically you have to map out the rule set if you're speaking in firewall terms. Okay, so you have to check out what happens if I access this website. Is it DNS filtering? Is it IP filtering? Are my packets dropped? For instance, what happened, maybe a little side story from my experiments. For instance, when I did the DNS experiments with resolving 50 domains in China and 50 domains in Germany, I couldn't access my server for 3 or 4 days. Okay, and this happened quite often. So I had often the problem that although the server was alive and running and up and running in China, I couldn't reach it from Germany. Okay, so basically I emailed and faxed the provider in China. I was like, hey guys, what's the story? I paid for this. I need access to the server. They're like, it's sitting here. It works. No problem. Yeah. So apparently, and that's what I saw from packet traces, my packets are in between. I just dropped. Okay, so as soon as I enter the Chinese network, basically they dropped. So this happened quite often. It was very annoying because I couldn't do my work when the server was not available apparently. Okay, so then when you figured out how strict the filtering is and how it works, for instance the reset packets I showed you earlier, then obviously you can make a guess on what kind of techniques they employ. They could use layer 3, 4 filtering, they could use layer 3, 4 and 7 filtering. So this is something you have to enumerate. And once you identify this information, you have to come up with an appropriate way how to circumvent it. So in a nutshell, it's basically the same way as you would bypass any firewall, but it has some neat properties I want to show. So basically, the Clayton method is the first method I want to show you. The Clayton method was discovered by a guy called Richard Clayton, and it was discovered by I think him in June 2006. He's a researcher from the University of Cambridge. So how does it work? We have the same setup as before. We have a user that tries to access the internet and access the target. Okay, so we have still the adversary that's inspecting the traffic as it goes along. But now the question is, what happens if on both sides of the connection, so you need to have control of both sides of the connection, which is not always, it's probably not often the case, but if you have full control over the user as well as the target system, then what you can do in your firewall is just ignore reset packets. Okay, so packets with the reset flag set. Okay, so now basically, although the advisory here is injecting forged reset packets into the connection, so sending basically reset packets to you, but also to the target system, as you ignore them, the connection will just simply continue. Okay, so interestingly, the Chinese government, they don't drop the traffic, they just inject forged reset packets to both ends of the connection, but the data flows. Okay, so if you have a way of ignoring these packets, the connection will proceed unhindered. Okay, so that's one way to circumvent the current way the filtering works in China. But there's a little trick here. Obviously, if this is you as the user and you want to access in China and you want to access CNN.com, apparently you have no control over their firewall rule set. So, although theoretically it's a perfect method and it's very interesting and it's easy but also very effective, in practice it's not very feasible because, you can't tell CNN, please ignore reset packets. Okay, so you can do a lot of things, but probably not that. Okay, so it works, but it's not perfect. So you can use alternative DNS servers. And if they are tamper-free, if you use, they must not be located in North Rhine-Westphalia because they are manipulated as well. But if they are, let's say, in Bavaria or some other country outside Germany, then then basically it should work. Okay. So and apparently, interestingly, is that when I did the testing from China, I saw that you can make DNS connections to any DNS server in the world. That was no problem. Okay. But as I said before, the DNS requests came back to me untempered. Yeah, that's a question. Okay, I can repeat your question if you want.
Well, first of all, this well, not the poem. I'm talking about the fact that things are not
actually, I'm living in China.
The feature is that
I'm wondering whether you tested this DNS stuff
in there,
just from the dedicated
like,
server
have
you
you ever
rented.
wondered?
Yeah.
I don't know if you've experienced it yourself, but I've certainly heard a lot of Apple users say that, Apple has this wonderful way of making every release faster on the same hardware.
Okay. So the question was basically whether I tested this only on a dedicated server or whether I tested this also on a cable modem in China. As I said, to answer your question, no. Because I did only rent the server and I was not there in person, so I couldn't test it and I didn't have any contacts. So I thought that the best way to do it would be to rent a server. Obviously, if you're an end user, this probably will be different. But as I come later in this presentation, or maybe I can do this now, I would love to do actually some more research. So if you are willing, and I would like to join, and maybe there are other people in the room that like to join us, we can rent a new server. We can use, if you have the DSL modem or cable modem in China, then perfect. Let's start some research. So we can figure out how it actually works. There's a lot of work to be done, to be honest, and I couldn't do everything. So it's just a start. So if you're interested, we can do some research. Yeah, I do. To be honest, I was thinking a lot for a long time whether I should go to China to an internet cafe and try to do the stuff directly there, but for some reason I chose not to. Yeah. There's a question in the back.
This is like a salt, like they verify that everything is fine and dandy, and if it is,
Yeah. That's a big problem as well. Yeah, the question, or there was a comment saying basically the filtering is different depending on which part in China you're actually in. Well, of course, it's a big country, and so we would have, in order to do some, let's say, representative research, we would need access to different servers or different places in China. That's something I didn't have. If there are people in the audience that can support me or like to join me on this, you're very welcome. Of course, yeah, because I didn't have enough time, and I didn't have contacts in China, so I did this the way I thought it would be the best, but obviously there are other ones, and we could all work on this together if you like to. So coming back to, because we can answer some questions later on, coming back to this presentation, as I said, the DNS servers, you're free to use them, and you're free to resolve CNN, for instance, without any problems, okay? But then again, as I said, they also employ IP filtering, so I wasn't able, although I was able to resolve the domain correctly, I was unable to access it because they employ IP filtering, okay? So, yeah, bad Troy, basically. We have to figure out other ways of circumventing the Great Firewall of China, okay? So you can use alternative proxies. Yeah, that's something I tried and it didn't work, so yeah, we can skip this. Basically, my idea was, okay, to set up a central proxy in Germany and then send all requests to that proxy and then just use it to get onto the internet. And the same filtering as applies as before, so if I try to access a certain website, then there will be the reset packet sent and my connection is dropped again. Okay, but we can use something called tunneling, okay? And, okay, something I couldn't figure out, and maybe somebody in the audience can say to me, I assume encryption is illegal in China. So, yeah, I wonder why they gave me SSH access for my dedicated server anyway. Because if it's not allowed, then that was illegal already. But apparently you can use any protocol you like. I tried DNS tunneling, I tried ICMP tunneling, SSH tunneling, what else did I do? HTTP tunneling, SMTP, I tried a whole lot, and they all worked. Okay, so that's cool. But I found out that for some protocols, for instance, I tried ICMP tunneling with a program called ptunnel, ping tunnel basically. The problem is that DNS resolution is still done in China. Okay, so as the DNS resolution is subject to filtering or manipulation, this is not a cool approach because you're still subject to filtering. So you have to figure out other ways to bypass this. Well, as you're all very technical aware of what you can do with SSH, yeah, it's a perfect way out. And I spoke with guys from Force10, and Force10 is a hardware provider that's used, because I gave this talk before at the D6 in Germany, and they have replaced all the hardware with hardware from Force10. And the Force10 guys were saying basically, well look, we delivered hardware to China, and so did Cisco and Juniper. And for instance, we could drop SSH connections as soon as we see your the handshaking bit. But apparently, for some reason, at the moment, they're not doing this. So what you could do, you could just encapsulate your data in a transport protocol, send it to what's called a gateway host. That will unwrap your request into the whatever protocol you're actually trying to speak, and will send it to the target system. Okay, so that's not something special, but I will give a short demonstration on how to do SSH filtering. This is not special, you all know how this works, but it is a proof of concept that even in China there is a way of accessing amnesty.org. Okay, so what you do is, obviously I log into my private server, that's no problem. I have 3 different windows here, a German server, which I'm going to start a proxy, the exported display of the Chinese server, and the SSH tunnel to my Chinese server. Okay, so what I'm doing now is I'm starting a proxy server on my German server. So there's Squid starting up, no problem. Now what I do now is now I connect to my Chinese server, and once I'm connected, I'm just doing normal port forwarding to actually establish a session between China and Germany, which is secured by SSH. And again, this is not something I need to explain. You all know how this works. So SSH, MySL, and so forth. And basically, what happens then, as when I export the display, so I'm saying basically port 5000 should be locally on the box in China should be forwarded to port 3128, listening on the local host of my private server in Germany. Okay, so once this connection is established, it's cryptographically secure, and yeah, if this now works. Okay, so now I'm logged in. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to export the display of the Chinese server. That's what I did. I'm changing the proxy settings on the Chinese. This is basically the exported conqueror of the Chinese server, so it's a bit slow. But if I change the proxy settings to localhost port 5000, this will be forwarded to my German server to the script running on that server. And as you will see now, this is one way of accessing